Hi, all. So I've been asked to speak on the Beckham family feud that everybody's talking about this week, and I do have a lot of thoughts on it. I think my thoughts might be a little bit left of center, though, so bear with me, okay? I think that Brooklyn Beckham, in many ways, fits right into my kind of imperfect victim series here, and I'll explain why. Just as like a brief recap to remind everybody like what happened in case you didn't know. Earlier this week, Brooklyn Beckham dropped basically a nuclear bomb on Instagram, basically aired out his side of the family feud that's been bubbling under the surface for the past 2 years. We've all seen, there's been a lot of rumors, there's been a lot of blind items, unfollowed, there's wedding dress drama, but this time Brooklyn really aired out his side of the story. And it really felt as if that post was not about reconciliation. It was about finalizing a rupture, you know? And, as somebody who has had familial ruptures myself, like, I understood the tone of that post because I've written things like that myself, okay? To me, what I see when I saw that post is that I feel like things reached a breaking point. I think that it's basically been years of quiet dysfunction simmering underneath the surface, and now we're just seeing a flashpoint. And people do blame Nicola Peltz for the problem, but I honestly think that this would have happened with or without Nicola. And fundamentally, let me explain why. David and Victoria Beckham, besides the royal family, are probably the most famous people and most important people in England. David is a legendary football, or soccer as we in America call it, soccer star. And Victoria Beckham, like the Spice Girls, were like famous at a time where there still very much was a monoculture, and she was one of the most popular Spice Girls, and she went on to really make her name for herself in a fashion career, okay? Brooklyn Beckham is the firstborn child to those parents, those extremely accomplished, self-starting, hardworking, but also high expectation holding parents. I learned this week when I was like researching this whole thing that David Beckham actually like named the kid Brooklyn because he said like, oh, well, what if Brooklyn becomes a soccer star? In which that way his name being Brooklyn, like it would make sense. So it was almost like the expectation of him to accomplish at least something akin to what his parents accomplished was placed upon him from birth, basically. And I think that Brooklyn, quite frankly, seems to be painfully mediocre. And I say that with empathy. You know what I mean? I say that with empathy. I think he's a kid who was expected to reach these heights, especially as the firstborn, and have all these gifts and have all these talents because he comes from such a talented bloodline, but it just didn't really have it or have whatever to cut it, right? And I think that that's probably, and I think that his family has probably quietly looked down on him for that, for like the duration of his adult and young adult life and childhood, you know? So he's probably been consistently by his family looked down upon, right? Looked down upon, seen as less than, and there's been these pressure and these expectations put on him to be something that he fundamentally is not. And that is psychologically painful, okay? Like Brooklyn is deeply privileged. Obviously, that's not up for a debate. You know, he is the most nepotistic of all Nepo babies, okay? But just because you're privileged doesn't mean that you're protected from family trauma. In fact, being highly privileged creates a different set of familial traumas that families of less magnitude can't necessarily relate to. I just think it makes it harder for people to like believe you or see your side or see you as a victim. But you have to understand that he had a profound amount of privilege, and it's quite shocking to know the level of privilege that he managed to fumble. But at the end of the day, some of us are just fucking average, girl. Not everybody is a star. Not everybody is the best at everything. Not everybody is meant to rise to these like incredible heights, right? And if someone just fundamentally does not have that sort of stuff in them, and you keep trying to push them into being something that they're not, they are going to become deeply resentful, deeply frustrated, deeply angry, and quite frankly, probably deeply hateful of you as well. You know what I mean? And with regard to Nicola Peltz, okay, is she a villain? Is she a life raft? I don't really know that girl, okay? I don't know, and I don't know anything about their relationship, and I've never like pulled tarot on her. I don't know anything about her energy. I've only seen her briefly in pictures, so I can't get a read on her. I really can't, you know? But what I do know is that some people say that she's controlling. Some people say that she's his escape. Maybe she's both, girl. Maybe she's both. what all that matters to me, or what I think, is that Brooklyn experiences her as liberating, and I think that that's the most important thing here. What I do know is that for a kid who probably persistently felt as if who he was and what he was doing was never enough to his parents, to have a woman, a beautiful woman from a very wealthy billionaire family, look at him and say, I choose you, was probably one of the most profoundly impactful things that happened to him emotionally and psychologically. And that is why he's willing to burn everything to the ground, basically in service of protecting that relationship. It makes sense to me, honestly. I can also understand why Brooklyn marrying somebody like Nicola Peltz, whose family is arguably more wealthy than the Beckhams, would create tension in a family unit where the family is trying to shape him to be a certain way. The Beckhams are an extremely powerful family, yes, but the Peltzes are also an incredibly powerful family. So it's probably a source of conflict and a power struggle for Brooklyn, the sort of black sheep child who the family still feels like they need to shape, to now have access to a family that's even wealthier than his. Of course, it's going to cause some bad feelings. And let me be clear, I'm not diagnosing anybody with narcissism, okay? But I do want to talk to you guys a little bit about a narcissistic family structure. In a narcissistic family structure, it's usually like the kids are triangulated against each other, and there's different roles. There's like the black sheep, the golden child, the lost child, okay? And I really think that Brooklyn feels very much like black sheep, lost child vibes. You know what I mean? And narcissistic family units are often obsessed with optics, and they will triangulate the siblings against each other, and they will perform these sort of power plays at emotionally significant milestones, okay? And that the reason why I'm bringing that up is because of the behavior around the wedding. Like the behavior around the wedding, and the fact that, like, I don't know, Victoria took away the dress, or didn't want to design the dress last minute, making Nicola have to scramble for a dress last minute, and then Mark Anthony only talked about Victoria at the wedding. I also found it to be dark-sided that the siblings were speaking out against Brooklyn, because one of the most painful things you can do to a child is have their own siblings turn against them, because it really drives home the point that you're the problem. You're the problem, And I think that that is fundamentally dark-sided, right? I'm not saying that Brooklyn is perfect, right? In fact, I think Brooklyn is deeply imperfect. I think Brooklyn is remarkably mediocre insofar as being handed all of these things and not really being able to make much of himself at all, okay? But at the same time, I don't think that just because you're remarkably mediocre that you don't deserve love. I think everybody deserves to be loved for who they are. And I think that I'm sure he has wonderful qualities. They may not be being the most accomplished, but maybe he's funny, or maybe he's is witty, or maybe, I don't know, maybe he's good at making Legos. I don't know, girl. Everybody has good qualities, and everybody deserves love. Love should not be conditional upon how much you accomplish or how great you are. So in my heart, I do feel a lot of empathy for Brooklyn. I think he probably spent his life trying to live up to David and Victoria's legacy, and I just don't think he could hack it. And instead of being allowed to be lost, he basically has been punished for not being exceptional, which is kind of sad, quite frankly. So in conclusion, what do I think of Brooklyn Beckham and his fight with the Beckhams? I think that there's probably blood on everybody's hands. I think that everybody's wrong. But I do, in my heart, fundamentally feel sorry for Brooklyn. I just feel like he's a kid who kind of failed to launch and was punished for it and alienated for it and isolated for it in his incredibly successful and powerful family, and has now found somebody to love him for who he is. But I would encourage Brooklyn, were he to ever see this, which he won't, what I would encourage him is that being who your parents told you to be is one thing, but your entire identity being in rebellion to your parents is also not being your true self. True authenticity for a kid like this will come from proper rupture from the family structure, okay? And finding himself kind of on his own. I hope he can find himself inside this relationship, but he may not. And that relationship may fall apart too, and he may have to find himself later in life. Extracting yourself from the family unit is a powerful first step, but the next step has to be inner work to figure out who Brooklyn is deep down. And that, I think, is the most important thing that he could do for himself. And I hope that he finds what he's looking for. I really do. But truly, as a person who can relate to the family structure that he came to, and from one black sheep to another, I wish him luck on his journey. And that's all I really have to say.